speak in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. As Monitoring 7 beginning today marks the start of the third month of reflections on groups in our community that require particular reflection and attention. In September, we reflected on the impact of COVID-19 on the young. Last month, we observed Black History Month, and now in November, we're going to be reflecting on the elderly. I've been really struck by the power of the testimony in these sessions, particularly when it's come from our own people. People like Casey and Clem have invited us to stand in their own shoes and see things very differently. And all of a sudden, injustices that are theoretical become very real and visceral. So, in beginning this third month of reflection, I'm aware of a risk of overload. It's so easy to feel helpless in the face of so much injustice and human need. We understandably yearn for some dramatic change and wonder where it'll come from. So it's important to remember that simply being more aware is part of the answer. For it's only being more aware that we can be moved to do our bit, however small. Important as changes in policy and practice at the national level are, what really brings about change, what George Eliot famously called in Middlemarch, those unhistoric acts. Those acts of thoughtfulness and kindness that occur in the midst of everyday life. Undramatic they may be, but cumulatively they are revolutionary. So in that spirit, a few thoughts to begin our reflections on the elderly. Well, considering the current situation, it's hard not to conclude that as a society we don't value the elderly as we should. When the pandemic began, the government assured us that a key reason for lockdown was the protection of the most vulnerable. What happened? Elderly patients were decanted from hospital into care homes without being tested for COVID-19. And care homes were amongst those least likely to get supplies of PPE. And the result? Well, around 40% of all deaths in the UK in the first wave of the pandemic were in or related to care homes. But what are those fortunate enough not to be infected by COVID-19? The story is very often a distressing one, and it comes very close to home. Many of you will know Lena Rennick. Lena is a resident of Compton Lodge. She has been increasingly frail and hard of hearing for a very long time. Visits from family and friends are a lifeline for her, but they have been cruelly curtailed by COVID, such that Sonia, whom many of you know, is the only person who has been able to visit her once a week in Compton Lodge. And with impossible restrictions, such that Sonia has had to sit 6 feet away from her mother and has been unable to touch her. Now, you can only imagine how distressing this is for Lena, not to mention Sonia, and I'll leave her to tell you much of the rest of the story. But you should know that things have got worse. Until recently, Sonia could only see her mum through a window. And the picture she showed me of Lena behind the window, staring out sadly, is one of the saddest things I've seen in a very, very long time. And now, worse still, Sonia isn't even allowed through the gates of the home. She can't even see her mother through the glass. Now, we all appreciate that care homes and hospitals are in a very difficult position. It's vital that staff, as well as residents, are protected from the virus. But surely there must be a way of ensuring that frail elderly are not condemned to isolation and loneliness in perpetuity. The campaign group Rights for Residents, started by 2 women in a similar position to Sonia's, are pressing for closest family members to be granted key worker status and the regular testing that goes with that, so that they can visit and be close to their elderly loved ones. The government is considering piloting this. Well, that's good news, but we're now in the 9th month of this pandemic. Why has it taken so long? This disregard for the elderly was in evidence long before COVID-19 entered our consciousness. Last year, in our lecture series, the author Nikki Gerard gave an impassioned talk about the plight of her father who suffered dementia. He went into hospital for treatment of leg ulcers. Despite the dementia, he was strong, mobile, smiling, and able to feed himself and do all things necessary for a decent quality of life. 5 weeks later, he emerged skeletal, incontinent, and immobile, and requiring 24-hour care. During that time, Nikki and her family had been denied access to him and any part in his care. They attributed his decline not to the neglect of the medical team, far from it. It was the lack of care from those who loved him that was the problem, and there are thousands of others in the same situation. And if you are thinking that the situation here in Britain is uniquely awful, you would be wrong. By way of example, our record in care homes during the current pandemic may well have been woeful, but the situation is the same throughout most, not all, Western nations. Indeed, take Sweden and Canada, both countries we associate with high levels of social care. Deaths in care homes there proved to be even worse than ours. Rich Western societies, it seems, value productivity and utility above all else. Otherwise, how could we be so oblivious to the needs of the elderly? If that's right, then it's worth asking what we lose with what can seem like an obsession with youth and a disregard for the elderly. Just recently, I listened to Andrew Marr's programme Start the Week, in which his guests were Marilyn Robinson, the novelist, and Rowan Williams. And quite apart from anything else, it was heartening to listen to a programme which featured 2 prominent Christian intellectuals and to have their views treated with great interest and respect. They were discussing the current state of Western civilization. And Rowan Williams made the observation that we are at risk as a civilization of losing our capacity to learn. He was referring to our increasingly hectic pace of life and the impact of much modern media, which commands constant attention and thereby causes constant stimulation, such that our ability to pause and carefully reflect is diminished. For without such thoughtful reflection, we cannot learn and we lose perspective. Now, I've been mulling this thought ever since, and it came to mind when reading today's Gospel reading, the Sermon on the Mount. It struck me that what the sermon describes is an attitude of life informed by wisdom. Jesus tells us, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." To be poor in spirit means knowing you don't have all the answers and never did. You're not as strong as you wish you were, and you know for sure you're going to die one day. That you face challenges that frightened you and threatened to overwhelm you. That such joys as you have known were gifts and not yours by right. In short, only the poor in spirit truly know their need of God. We are none of us born with this kind of wisdom. It's the fruit of experience, reflected on, meditated on, and prayed upon. Assuredly, age is no guarantee of wisdom, and we all know that. But equally, there is no wisdom in this world without experience. And wisdom is something of which our world is sorely in need. So let's take some time this month to listen to the voice of the elderly. Doing so out of respect, the respect they are due as fellow children of God, and in the expectation that we might just learn something. Amen.